I know that this has nothing to do with my channel, but I would like to touch on a topic that is topical for us. We see how Ukraine and Russia are suffering. We see how children, women, and not only Palestinians and Israelis are suffering. I would like to see peace finally come to our planet. We should create and develop for the better, not destroy our world. Let us live in friendship. With your permission, I will begin the story. I was 20 years old. Walking in the park in the evening, I saw a very beautiful girl sitting on a bench. The first time I saw her, I realized I was in love. I think that's what you call love at first sight. In all my high school years, I never fell in love with anyone. I was only interested in a couple of girls. And then there she was, Nancy. I went up and met her. The next day, in a flurry of new feelings for me, I actively showed various signs of attention, but in vain. Perhaps she just didn't notice them, but most likely Nancy just didn't want to reciprocate. Desperate, I began to spend on gifts with my saved money, which I was saving for a motorcycle. Expensive perfumes, countless bouquets of roses. I spared no expense, and everything was not in vain. Soon, Nancy admitted that she loved me too. This state is simply impossible to describe in words. Those who have experienced similar things will understand me. First love, after all. Encouraged, I invited her to a movie, and Nancy agreed. And although I was very nervous, the movie came out just right, and the date was a success. I relaxed, and when I walked her home, I was able to communicate with her easily and freely. It is possible that strange phenomena began to occur with me at this time. As we chatted casually, we didn't notice when we reached her driveway. Nancy told me that the light bulbs were broken and that she was afraid of the dark. With this simple excuse, she asked me to walk her to her apartment. I went to the elevator and was about to press the button when Nancy exclaimed, "Stop." Such a startled exclamation made me flinch. I turned around and stared at her in amazement. "Stop what?" I didn't understand. "Don't push the button." Nancy grabbed my sleeve and pulled me away from the elevator. Uncomprehending, I gave in to her efforts. "What's the matter? What's wrong with you, my love? It better not be working." She, breathing heavily, squinted warily at the elevator. I didn't understand what was going on. "Maybe you can explain it to me," I exclaimed impatiently. "What's wrong with this elevator?" "I can explain it to you," she said uncertainly. "But you won't laugh, will you?" "I'll try," I grinned. "You still won't believe it," she sighed. "About 2 months ago, some Satanist jerk drew a sign in the elevator. What it meant, I don't know. Underneath it were the words, 'In the name of Astaroth.' I don't know who Astaroth is either. But after all this, everyone who used the elevator felt bad and saw all sorts of devilish things. Some of them even had to go to witch doctors." "Did you seek help from psychologists?" I asked carelessly. "And you didn't try to erase the mark?" "I erased the mark, except it didn't stop after that. It got worse. The elevator got stuck, even though it was working fine before. And sometimes the lights would go out." Nancy shuddered. "It was awful. And when I saw that sign, I never went in there again. I'm superstitious." "I see." I smiled. "If you never go in it again, how do you know the elevator is cursed?" "That's what the neighbors say." "Well, they say a lot of things. I told you you wouldn't believe it." Nancy sighed. "But promise me, you won't go in there." "Okay. Okay, whatever." I waved goodbye, walked out of the driveway, and headed home. My mind was spinning with the thought of where to get money. I had already spent all my savings on gifts and flowers. The mystery of the elevator didn't interest me at all at that time. The next day, I got up early in the morning. The thought that I was dating the girl I loved cheered me up better than any coffee. Nancy called me and asked me to pick her up. I gladly answered and said I would be there in 10 minutes. Knowing that Nancy valued punctuality, I did my best to meet the promised time. 10 minutes later, I was already approaching the driveway. I accidentally ran into the elevator without thinking about anything. My mind started to go to completely different thoughts. It was probably a big mistake. I pressed the elevator button for the 4th floor. The elevator moved abruptly, with a creak, to its destination. The lights flickered warily. I glanced at my wristwatch, noting with satisfaction that I was almost not late. 2nd floor, 3rd, and the elevator stopped with a wild screech, dropping abruptly a meter. Losing my balance, I fell to my knees. In shock, I jumped up, frantically pressing all the buttons. Memories of yesterday's conversation immediately surfaced in my mind. What if it was true? Skepticism was unnecessary in this situation. The elevator didn't respond. Anger boiled up inside me, and I started kicking the door in a rage. Suddenly, I felt an unnatural chill. My hands literally went numb. It must be self-hypnosis, I thought in despair, or the heat is off. I don't know. I didn't want to admit that a supernatural entity might be living here, right next to me. The lamp that had dimly lit the elevator with flickering light went out completely. Fear turned to panic, my heart pounding in my chest. Footsteps were heard on the other side of the stairs. I started pounding on the door with my fists and calling out to her. There was no answer. I listened, but the footsteps were quiet. Maybe I was imagining things. At any rate, she must have heard my frantic pleas for help. Several things happened at once. A breath hit me in the back of the neck, a whisper sounded nearby, and a heavy hand rested on my shoulder. I was paralyzed with horror. My eyes darkened. I staggered. And meanwhile, the whisper continued to say to me in an unknown language something incomprehensible but clearly threatening. My consciousness became blurred, and I felt dizzy. Already on the verge of fainting, I noticed that the doors were opening. I staggered out of the elevator. Without realizing what I was doing, I knocked on Nancy's door, and a few moments later it opened. Nancy stared at me in shock. I realized now what had frightened her. In front of her stood a pale, bleary-eyed, cold-sweating, frightened boy. "What's the matter?" Nancy asked, ushering me into the apartment. Stammering, I whispered something about an accident. "God, you're pale," Nancy exclaimed. "Let me make some strong tea with lemon. Get undressed and come in." She ran into the kitchen. I bent over and, with wooden hands, tried to untie my shoelaces. "Should we call an ambulance?" Nancy shouted from the kitchen. I was feverish and mumbled something inaudible in response. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement, and my gaze immediately followed it. I didn't move, but my shadow did. Slowly but surely toward the kitchen. Now the outline of the shadow didn't resemble my physique. It looked more like a hunched old man with a long shirt tied around his lean body. All this I managed to see in a split second, and in the next instant I was already rushing down the stairs, not thinking clearly, and Nancy was shouting after me. After a while, I jumped out of the entrance and, breathing heavily, walked. That's when my cell phone rang. It was probably Nancy, but I just didn't bother answering it. After everything that had happened, everything around me felt somehow unreal. I walked as if in a fog, and my mind left me. Wild fear did not allow me to reproduce in my head the chain of events that had happened to me. I just walked forward, as far away from this cursed place as possible. Passers-by, suspiciously squinting at me. Apparently, my appearance reminded me of a drug addict, avoided me. I approached the crosswalk and waited for the green light. Suddenly, I felt a jolt in my back, and flying forward, collapsed on the asphalt. The car on the right, braking sharply, almost crushed me. After wiping my shattered lip, I looked back in shock but saw no one. No one. Yesterday, that would have surprised me wildly, but not today. Ignoring the driver's furious shouts, I stood up and walked on. Staggering, I reached home, where I told my parents what had happened. There was no point in telling the truth. Atheists like my parents are hard to find. All the more, I hoped that this day would be the end of it all. But it didn't end there. I realized it when I saw that shadow in my house. My own shadow, but not mine either. That hunchbacked silhouette again. It was almost always with me now, but somehow only I saw it. I thought I was going to go crazy. I felt his presence all the time. I was afraid to fall asleep, and when I fell asleep, I felt it lying next to me. I didn't know what exactly it wanted, but it wasn't hard to guess. Every day I was getting worse. At night, I had nightmares in which I was tormented by a creature that looked like a hunchbacked demon. In addition, strange thoughts began to appear in my head, and in a strange way, as if someone were forcing them on me. This whispering in my head made me do a horrible thing. I cursed my grandmother. After that, she started having heart problems. To the horror of my parents, their serious talk with me went nowhere. I argued with my parents and tried to leave them, but my parents wouldn't let me go, citing my sickly appearance. Then I broke up with Nancy too. In short, it was very hard and painful for me. I didn't understand what was happening to me. This thing was controlling me like a puppet. I was trapped. For the first time in my life, bad thoughts of doing something bad to myself flashed through my mind. But were they really my thoughts? Help came from an unexpected direction. I was on my way to the doctor's office and was standing at the bus stop waiting for the bus. While waiting for the bus, I caught myself thinking that I was afraid of being alone. The last time that thought pushed me under a car. What if the same thing happens when the bus arrives? But after a few moments, I realized I wasn't alone. Feeling someone's gaze on me, I turned around and saw an elderly woman. She was staring intently at my face. Despite her diminutive appearance and small stature, there was a kind of strength and warmth in this old woman. I felt in my gut that I should approach her. It was very strange. I was magnetically drawn to her. "Hello," I mumbled as I approached her. She looked me over, chewing her tongue. My grandmother replied, "Hello, young man. Do you often act contrary to the people around you, or do you just have a bad memory?" "What?" I asked, perplexed. "Why did you trample on the cursed place? Were you in this neighborhood?" "But how do you know?" I marveled. "Because God gave it to me," she said. "I know many things. You, young man, have caught a demon, and an ancient one at that. A very strong, powerful one. He's here now, right behind you." She glanced at me over her shoulder. "And he doesn't like me talking to you, but I want to help you. Astaroth is bullying you, but you're a good person. I can see that. I don't know why, but I believed every word." The very sight, look, and voice of this grandmother inspired boundless trust. "Who is Astaroth?" I whispered. "Satan has many servants and countless legions. Some are lower in rank, some are higher. Astaroth is one of the highest-ranking demons, one of the 8 princes, subordinate to the 4 supreme spirits of evil: Lucifer, Leviathan, Satan, and Belial. You are very unlucky to have met him. It won't be long before you are possessed by him." I was literally paralyzed with terror. I begged the old woman for help. "Yes, I will help you," she nodded. "You are still pure, and you haven't done much wrong, so it's worth helping you. Just because you are pure of heart, Astaroth has not possessed you completely yet." The old woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a small black knife. Bringing it to her lips, she began to whisper something almost inaudible. Then she held the knife out to me. "Take it." I took it and examined it. It had symbols on it that looked like triangles. What was it for? I stared at the old woman in confusion. What am I supposed to do with it? The old woman asked, "And how does the demon usually manifest itself?" "Well, I see it in the form of a humped shadow." Still not understanding, I answered. "And this shadow is mine. So listen, the next time the demon appears, stab it with this knife. And do it in such a way that the shadow of the knife pierces the demon's shadow. Then it will leave and go back to where it came from." I started to thank her. "You don't need to thank me. Forget about the hospital today and go home." "Well, run along." I hurried home. As it turned out, my father and mother had already come home. I wasn't expecting that, and I was horrified to think that I'd have to face the demon alone and try to exorcise it. I sat down on the couch, looking around tensely. Complete silence. My nerves are on edge. And then he appeared. I couldn't see him, but I inexplicably felt his presence, and I could feel that he was very angry. He was furious. I got up from the couch, trembling, and looked at my shadow. It began to change. First, the hump stood out. Then the figure itself changed, finally taking on the appearance of a skinny, hunchbacked freak. I gripped the knife tighter. There was a voice in my head, whispering something quickly. I tried not to listen to the demon and wanted to do as my grandmother had advised me. I quickly jabbed the shadow of my knife at Astaroth. There was a wild shriek, like scrambling, in my head. I felt lightheaded and rolled my eyes upwards, followed by an extraordinary lightness in my chest and great joy. I looked at the knife. It had black drops on it. As far as I know, the residents of that house still avoid using that damn elevator. The demon that dwells in it remains a prisoner. No one knows how to free it, and no one wants to know. Everything in my life is back to normal. I stopped being sick, made peace with Nancy, apologized to my grandmother, and apologized to my parents. Everything was good in my life. More scary stories you will find on my channel. See you soon.